Most Saturdays, Edward Hayes liked to start slow fresh coffee in his Denver kitchen. Sunlight spilling across the granite countertops he and his late wife Margaret had chosen together, and the hum of the neighborhood waking up outside. But that peaceful ritual shattered when his phone rang at 7 a.m. The caller, I'd read David Hayes' son, who almost never called this early. "Dad, we really want you to come to Sophie's birthday party today." "Maybe a little early," David said, his voice just a touch too fast. In the background, Edward caught a flash of Carla's sharper tone, urging him to add something. David continued, "We've got some important family matters to talk about." Before the guests arrive, Edward leaned back in his chair, the steam from his coffee curling upward like a question mark. In all of Sophie's 9 birthdays, he'd never once needed convincing to show up. Why the special push this time? Why did David's voice carry that same nervous undertone Edward remembered from the day? Decades ago, when his teenage son confessed to wrecking the family truck. Still, the thought of Sophie's smile tugged at him. "Of course I'll be there," he said. But as he hung up, the businessman's instincts he'd honed over 40 years whispered something else entirely. Whatever this family matter was, it wasn't about balloons and cake. Edward hung up the phone and just sat there for a moment, staring at the mug between his hands. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he barely noticed. 40 years in construction had taught him to trust what his gut was telling him, and right now, that gut said David and Carla weren't inviting him early to make small talk. He rose from the table, heading down the hall, toward his bedroom, each step slow and deliberate. Margaret's voice, clear as the day she'd said it, came back to him. "Eddie, always keep an eye on David. He's got a good heart, but he's easily swayed. People make dangerous choices when someone strong is whispering in their ear." His closet, the air was still faintly scented with cedar and old aftershave. He scanned the rows of pressed shirts, some still wrapped in the dry cleaner's plastic, others worn soft with years of use. His fingers landed on the blue Oxford. It had been years since he'd worn it, not since Margaret's funeral. That day he'd caught Carla glancing around his house with an expression that was part sympathy, part appraisal. He remembered her offhand comment over the casserole dish. So much space for just one man. Pulling the shirt from the hanger, Edward thought about the numbers. Over the last 3 years, he'd given David and Carla roughly $85,000. A short-term mortgage catch-up that had turned into a year of payments. $6,000 car repair that mysteriously ballooned into a full engine replacement. Monthly tuition checks for Sophie's private school, always framed as giving her the future she deserves. And groceries, always groceries whenever Carla claimed their budget was a little tight that month. Margaret would have called it excessive. But she also would have understood why Edward kept saying yes. It wasn't for David or Carla, it was for Sophie. That little girl had been the one bright light in his life since he buried his wife. Still, as he buttoned his shirt, he couldn't shake the sense that the pattern was more than bad luck or poor budgeting. It felt deliberate, like someone slowly testing the limits of his generosity. On his way back through the kitchen, Edward's gaze fell on the refrigerator door. Sophie's latest crayon drawing was held in place with a magnet, 2 stick figures. Fishing beside a blue lake, best day ever, Grandpa scrawled across the bottom in bright purple marker. He smiled despite himself. Remembering that summer afternoon, how her laughter had carried across the water, how she'd insisted on baiting her own hook, then another memory slid in, unwelcome. Just 3 weeks earlier, Carla had stood in this same kitchen, her eyes roaming over the granite countertops, the high-end appliances, the custom cabinetry he and Margaret had picked out. "Edward," she'd said lightly, "don't you think a place this size is a lot to keep up with? There are some wonderful retirement communities where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or repairs." David had quickly changed the subject to Sophie's softball season, but Edward had caught the way Carla's gaze lingered on the house. Now, tying his shoes, he wondered if that comment had been more than idle chatter. He stepped into the garage. The morning light pooling across the hood of his silver Mercedes. Beside it, under a dust cover, sat Margaret's car. He still paid the insurance, still had it detailed twice a year, even though it hadn't moved in 3. Maybe that was the kind of thing they counted on his inability to let go of the past. his reluctance to say no when family was involved. But Edward hadn't built Hayes Construction into a multi-million-dollar company by ignoring warning signs. In his business, you always inspected the foundation before you built anything important. As he backed out of the driveway, he made a mental note. Whatever family matters David and Carla wanted to discuss, he'd be ready to listen. But he'd also be ready to read between the lines. And yet, despite the unease gnawing at him, couldn't bring himself to skip the one part of the day that mattered, finding the perfect birthday gift for Sophie. If this was going to be her last truly happy birthday before things changed, he was going to make sure she remembered it. By the time Edward reached the Northridge Mall, Colorado's sun was climbing high, splashing the parking lot in sharp light. It was only a little after 8, but families were already streaming toward the entrances, children tugging impatiently at their parents' hands. Edward parked near the main entrance, locked his Mercedes, and headed straight for the toy store. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Sophie had been fascinated by buildings ever since her school took a trip to see the Denver skyline from the observation deck at Republic Plaza. In the Lego section, he found the perfect thing, the Statue of Liberty architecture set. It was intricate, enough to challenge her, but still something she could finish with a bit of Grandpa's help on a rainy afternoon. The $200 price tag didn't bother him. He thought of it as an investment in her curiosity. "Would you like me to gift wrap it?" The young cashier asked. "Yes, please. It's for my granddaughter's birthday," Edward said, watching the clerk smile. He'd always liked giving gifts that made children's eyes light up. On his way out, he spotted the sporting goods store. Sophie had long outgrown the little pink bike she used to ride around her cul-de-sac. In the display window sat a sleek, deep blue Trek bicycle lightweight frame. Handbrakes she could handle, reflective strips for safety. Perfect. Another. $350, but he could already picture her face when she saw it, loading the boxed bike into the SUV. Edward checked his watch, still plenty of time before the party. Maybe he'd stop for flowers, too. Carla liked white roses. That was when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Edward, what a nice surprise. It was Dorothy Campbell, his neighbor for nearly 20 years, standing beside her SUV with a shopping bag from the bookstore. Silver hair was neatly styled as always, and she wore the bright-eyed smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed running into an old friend. "Morning, Dorothy," Edward said. "Starting your weekend errands early?" "Oh, you know me, like beating the crowds," she replied. "I suppose you're here for Sophie's birthday prep?" "David mentioned it when I saw him last week." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Mentioned it? Where'd you run into him?" "Downtown, Tuesday morning. He and Carla were coming out of First National Bank with quite a stack of papers. Looked important, probably refinancing or something," she said with a small chuckle. "They seemed very serious about it." Edward forced a nod. "Probably just routine business," he murmured. But inside, her words landed like a cold stoned hat. Tuesday morning, stack of official papers. That explained Carla's too bright enthusiasm on the phone and David's rehearsed invitation for him to arrive early. He thanked Dorothy, and they parted ways. But as he walked toward the florist, his mind was no longer on roses. He was replaying every recent conversation, every glance, every carefully worded offer of help from David and Carla. At the flower shop, he asked for a dozen long-stemmed white roses. The florist, a woman with soil still under her fingernails, wrapped them in silver paper with practiced care. "Special occasion?" she asked. "My granddaughter's birthday," he replied. "These are for her mother?" By the time Edward was driving home, his SUV held nearly $600 in gifts and flowers. Yet he couldn't shake Dorothy's comment about the bank. Banking business on Tuesday, a nervous call on Saturday. It was too neat to be coincidence, he told himself. There could be a harmless explanation, maybe a refinance, maybe a college savings plan for Sophie. But the businessman in him had learned long ago, when the numbers and the timing don't line up, something's usually wrong. As he pulled into his driveway, the morning sun reflected off the front windows of his house. Margaret's voice echoed in his mind again. Watch David carefully. He didn't yet know exactly what was coming, but he could feel it tightening around him, like a knot drawing closed. And before the day was over, he suspected that knot would pull tight enough to show its true purpose. by 2 o'clock sharp. Edward pulled up in front of David and Carla's sprawling suburban colonial in Centennial, Colorado, with a freshly power-washed driveway and a balloon arch over the front porch. Before he could knock, the door swung open and Carla's voice rang out like she was announcing the arrival of royalty. "Edward, you look absolutely wonderful today," she said, stepping forward with an enthusiasm so warm it almost felt theatrical. She clasped his arm, guiding him inside with both hands, as though they hadn't seen each other just weeks ago. The living room was awash in streamers and pastel balloons, far more elaborate than any birthday party they'd thrown for Sophie before. Tables groaned under trays of catered food, and there was even a rented chocolate fountain in the corner. Edward Sharp, I didn't miss the expense this setup had cost a small fortune. Dad, there he is. David emerged from the kitchen, with a wide grin, placing a firm hand on Edward's shoulder. "Come meet Mike from work. Mike, this is my amazing father I've told you so much about. Amazing father." Edward couldn't remember the last time David had introduced him with that much praise. Normally, his son described him as old school in business or stubborn about retirement plans. David's voice was bright and performative, the kind of tone people use when selling something. Across the room, Edward spotted Sophie, surrounded by friends near the gift table. She glanced up and broke into the genuine smile he'd been waiting for all day. She ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, handing her the gift bag. "Open this one first." She peeled back the paper to reveal the Lego Statue of Liberty set. "Wow," she whispered, eyes widening. But Edward noticed the brief shadow that crossed her face before she looked up. "Thank you, Grandpa. It's really cool." That hesitation stuck with him. 9-year-olds didn't normally have to think about how to sound grateful. As the party buzzed on, Edward let himself be drawn into conversation with Mike, while David kept interjecting with odd compliments about his wisdom and family loyalty. Carla floated in and out of the circle, always with a refill for Edward's wine glass, always touching his arm as if to anchor him in place. But the real tell wasn't in their words, it was in their eyes. Across the room, when they thought no one was looking, David and Carla exchanged quick, sharp glances, a tilt of the chin from him, a subtle nod from her. Perfectly timed interventions whenever talk veered toward anything financial. Even Sophie seemed to be carrying some invisible weight. When one of her friends asked about the Lego set, she smiled politely but didn't gush the way a child normally would over a brand new toy. Then came the comment from Mrs. Bennet, elderly neighbor, seated on the couch beside Edward. "She's such a thoughtful girl," she said softly. "Last week, she asked me if grandparents and parents ever disagree about important decisions." Edward's wine glass paused midair. "And what did you tell her? That families work through differences with love and honesty," Mrs. Bennet said. But I wondered what might have made her ask. Edward didn't wonder. Not anymore. The party began to wind down, but before the last guests had left, David caught Edward's attention with a too casual tone. "Dad, hang around after everyone?" "Goes okay? We've been looking forward to that family chat we mentioned." Edward gave him a polite nod, but inside, the knot in his stomach tightened. The stage was set, the actors in place, and he was no longer just a guest at his granddaughter's party. It was the target. Edward excused himself from the noisy living room, mentioning to Carla that he needed to find the bathroom. She jumped in immediately with overly detailed directions, as though he hadn't been in their house dozens of times before. Her tone was cheerful, but there was something in her eyes like a stage manager making sure the actor didn't wander off script. The hallway was quieter, lined with framed photos of Sophie at various ages, her first day of kindergarten, last year's softball team, a family trip to the Grand Canyon. Edward slowed his pace, letting the muted laughter from the party fade behind him. Then he heard the soft patter of footsteps. "Grandpa," came a small voice. He turned to find Sophie standing just a few feet away. Glancing back toward the living room to make sure no one was watching, she had the same determined look Margaret used to wear when she was about to say something that couldn't be unsaid. Edward crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "What is it, sweetheart? You look troubled." Sophie bit her lower lip. "I need to tell you something." about Mom and Dad. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her hands twisted the hem of her dress. They're planning to take your money. Tonight. After everyone goes home. The hallway seemed to tilt. Edward gripped the doorframe to steady himself, forcing his face to remain calm for her sake. What do you mean, take my money? I heard them talking last night, Mom said. He's got too much money for an old man living alone. Then she told Dad they were going to fix that problem tonight. They said the papers from the bank would make everything legal. Papers from the bank. Dorothy Campbell's. Casual remark about seeing David and Carla at first. National flashed through his mind. Now with a chilling clarity, Edward kept his voice gentle. Did they say anything else? Sophie's eyes darted toward the living room before she leaned in even closer. Dad kept saying, "What if he finds out?" Mom told him it would be too late by then. Her lip trembled. Don't. Want them to take your money? You're the only one who really listens to me. A wave of protectiveness surged through Edward. He pulled her into a hug, feeling the small, tense body of a child burdened with an adult's secret. It wasn't just the betrayal of his son and daughter-in-law, it was that they'd been careless enough, or cold enough, to let Sophie hear their scheme. You did the right thing telling me, he whispered into her hair. But we need to keep this just between us for now. Can you do that? She nodded against his shoulder. Are you going to stop them? She asked, her voice quivering. Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to handle everything. He leaned back so she could see his eyes. Yeah. But right now, we need to go back in there and act like everything's normal. Can you be brave for me? I think so, she said. Then, almost as if the question had been building inside her for days, she blurted, Will you still love me if Mom and Dad get mad? Edward felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Sophie, nothing your parents do could ever change how much I love you. Nothing. That finally brought a small smile to her face, the first genuine one he'd seen from her all afternoon. She squeezed him tight. Together they walked back, toward the noise and color of the party. But for Edward, nothing looked the same. The streamers, the balloons, the forced laughter from David and Carla all felt like a stage set built around a trap. And now he knew exactly who the intended prey was. Edward stayed just long enough for Sophie to open a few more gifts and cut the cake. He smiled where it was expected, laughed when someone told a joke, but the truth was, every nerve in his body was coiled tight. Every time David refilled a drink, or Carla flitted between guests, Edward felt their eyes on him watching, measuring, waiting. When the last of the school friends left with their parents, Edward made his move. I think I'd better head home, he said, rubbing his temple. His headache's been getting worse all afternoon. David's face fell instantly. Dad, wait. We wanted 2 tomorrow, Edward cut in gently. I'll be clearer-headed. In the morning, Carla's smile tightened at the edges, but she kept her voice sugary. Of course, rest up. 5 minutes later, Edward was in his Mercedes, the white roses in Sophie's crayon drawing on the passenger seat. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, David and Carla standing in the doorway. Their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Back home, the silence was no longer comforting. It was charged, humming with purpose. Edward walked straight to his home office. The room still smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender polish on the oak bookshelves. On the wall hung her portrait, smiling, confident, the way she'd looked when they built Hayes Construction. From a single truck into a thriving business, he reached behind the frame and spun the combination on the wall safe. The lock clicked open with the familiar sequence August 19th, 1959. The truth waited in neat folders, bank statements, showing the slow escalation of David and Carla's requests from a few hundred here and there. 2,000s at a time. Investment portfolios worth far more than they. New $2.4 million in liquid assets alone, property deeds for 3 fully paid rental homes, all generating income. A ledger documenting every single payment he'd made for them. 247 transactions over 3 years, totaling $85,000. Looking over the records, Edward saw the pattern clearly now. This hadn't been random bad luck or hard times. It was conditioning, slowly training him to say yes to larger and larger sums until signing away control of his life would seem like the natural next step. Carla's comment about assisted living 3 weeks ago replayed in his head. It hadn't been concern for his health. It had been reconnaissance. He sat back, the leather of his office chair creaking under him. "Not tonight," he murmured to Margaret's photo. "They're not taking one more thing, not a dollar. Not my home, not my independence." Asterisk from the desk drawer, he pulled a yellow legal pad and drew 3 columns. What they know: mortgage-free home, some savings, his habit of generosity. What they don't know: true asset value, rental properties, his legal and banking contacts. What I want them to think: that he was tired, confused, and ready to hand over the reins. For the next hour, Edward mapped out his counterplay. He'd need allies, trusted ones. James Walker at First National Bank had been a friend and business contact for 2 decades. Catherine Moore, the notary who'd handled contracts for Hayes Construction, was discreet and sharp-eyed. If David and Carla wanted a signature, they'd get one, but not the way they expected. Before he turned in for the night, Edward placed Sophie's drawing back on the refrigerator door. Her stick-figure family stood in front of a crooked little house, all smiles. He studied it for a long time, feeling both the weight of Margaret's last request and the fire of his own resolve. Tomorrow, he thought, the game changes. The next morning, Edward woke before sunrise. He'd slept little, his mind replaying Sophie's whisper and every suspicious glance from the day before. By the time the first light hit the Rockies outside his bedroom window, his plan was set. After showering and dressing in a casual flannel shirt and jeans clothes that made him look comfortably at home, but not frail, he carried his coffee into the office and reached for his worn leather address book. Under W was a name he'd trusted for 20 years. James Walker, Vice President at First National Bank. At precisely 9 o'clock, Edward dialed. "James, good morning. Hope I didn't catch you too early," Edward began. "Not at all." "Ed, always a pleasure. What's on your mind?" James's voice carried the same steady warmth Edward remembered from the many times they'd discussed loans and investments. "I've been thinking about simplifying my accounts, consolidating." "For easier management," Edward said, easing into the conversation. "Wondering what options the bank has for financial assistance programs?" There was a pause. "Are we talking about automated services or more hands-on management, power of attorney arrangements, that sort of thing?" Let the silence stretch just enough. "You've seen much of that lately?" "It's funny you should ask," James replied. "Just last week I had a couple come in, husband and wife, asking about guardianship procedures for an elderly family member. They were unusually prepared. Had already researched conservatorship requirements, mental competency evaluations, timelines for court approval, very thorough." Edward felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "That's so, did they?" "Seemed confident about what they were doing."
Yes.
"They even asked about expedited processes, emergency conservatorships, where the court can step in right away to protect assets from mismanagement. Most people have never even heard of that, unless a lawyer points them there." Slow breath, his mind racing. "They'd planned it down to the last detail," James continued, unaware of the storm building on the other end of the line. "They mentioned having documentation ready, medical opinions. Financial statements said they expected the process to move quickly once they initiated it. Seemed like they'd already lined up their ducks, if you know what I mean." Edward did know. They weren't just thinking about controlling his money. They were thinking about controlling him. The very idea made his jaw tighten. "Well, I appreciate the information, James," Edward said evenly. "Gives me a better picture of the options." "Anytime, Ed. And for what it's worth, you're sharper than half the young guys I see in here. Can't imagine you needing that kind of help for decades." After they hung up, Edward sat back in his chair. Now he had confirmation, not suspicion, not guesswork, but confirmation that David and Carla's trip to the bank had been about stripping him of his independence under the cover of family concern. He glanced at the yellow pad from the night before, the 3 columns of his plan still staring up at him. The what they know and what they don't know felt even more critical. The phone rang suddenly, making him flinch. The screen, lit with David's name, Edward let it buzz twice before answering, softening his voice into the weariness of an aging man. "Dad, I was worried about you leaving early yesterday," David said, concern laced into his tone. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, just these headaches." "Hard to concentrate?" Edward murmured. "That's not good. Maybe we should have you see a doctor. Carla and I can drive you this afternoon." "Perfect," Edward thought. They were accelerating their timeline. It's very thoughtful. "I could use the help," he said, letting a faint tremor into his voice. As they ended the call, Edward felt the steel in his spine harden. If they thought they were leading him toward their goal, they were in for a surprise. The trap was nearly set. Edward spent the next 30 minutes perfecting his performance. He ruffled his usually neat hair, chose an old cardigan with a frayed cuff, and loosened his gait to something slower, a little hesitant. In the mirror, he practiced the slight squint and occasional pause that suggested someone not entirely sure of what was happening. It wasn't vanity, it was strategy. By mid-afternoon, his call list was set. First was Catherine Moore, the notary he'd trusted for decades in his construction business. "Catherine," he said, keeping his tone calm but serious, "I need you at my house tomorrow morning around 10? Power of attorney documents. It's a family matter sensitive, so your professional discretion will be appreciated." "You know you can count on me, Ed," she replied. "I'll bring my seal and my journal." Next, he rang James Walker. "James, if you've got time tomorrow morning, I'd like you to stop by. Thought we could review my portfolio in more detail, of course," James said. "Still thinking about consolidating?" "Yes, and I think it might be educational," Edward added with the faintest hint of irony. With those arrangements in place, Edward called David. He let his voice tremble just enough to sound vulnerable. "Son, I've been thinking about those papers you mentioned. Your righty probably could use some help managing things. Why don't you come by tomorrow at 10? I'll have a notary here to make it official." David's relief was palpable. "That's great, Dad. Carla will be so glad you see it our way. We'll be there right on time." After the call, Edward sat back, letting the quiet settle. Across the kitchen, Sophie's crayon drawing still hung on the fridge, a crooked little house with stick figures labeled Grandpa, Daddy, Mommy, and me. He let his eyes rest on it for a long moment. Tomorrow, he thought, we find out what kind of parent Sophie really has. The night passed slowly. Edward lay awake, rehearsing how the morning would unfold. At 9:45, Catherine would arrive and set up at the side table in his office. At 10 o'clock sharp, James would walk in with his banker's portfolio, and David and Carla would show up with their leather case, expecting an easy victory. And that's when the truth would be exposed. The next morning was gray and cold, the kind of Colorado day that made you want to linger by the fire. But Edward was wide awake by 6, coffee in hand. Ready for the final act, Catherine arrived first, greeting him warmly before unpacking her notary tools. "Beautiful office," she remarked. Scanning the oak shelves and Margaret's framed portrait, James came next, right on the dot. "Morning, Ed. Ready to go over those numbers?" he said, giving Edward a knowing glance. The sound of tires crunching in the driveway signaled the final arrivals. David and Carla stepped in, smiling broadly until they saw the other two faces. In the room, Carla recovered first. "How thoughtful of you to arrange professional assistance. This will make everything so official." "Indeed it will," Edward said evenly, his voice steady, the act of frailty gone. "Please have a seat." David took the chair opposite Edward's desk, still smiling, though it was tighter now. "You sound better today, Dad. More like your old self." "It's exactly like my old self," Edward said, leaning forward. "Which is why I need to tell you something before we sign anything." He let the pause stretch, watching their expressions shift just slightly. David's smile faltering, Carla's pen hovering above her checklist. The trap was set. Tomorrow's papers wouldn't take his freedom, they would document their betrayal. Edward let the silence thicken, the kind of pause that made people fill it with their own nervous words. David shifted in his chair. Carla straightened, her pen poised. "I'm completely aware of your plan," Edward said finally, his voice calm but cutting. David's brow furrowed. "Dad, what plan?" We're just here to help. I know about your visit to First National last Tuesday. Edward interrupted, turning to James. James, would you mind sharing what they discussed? James leaned forward, professional and steady. They asked detailed questions about conservatorship procedures, how to declare someone mentally incompetent, and how to expedite court orders to take control of assets. They knew the legal terminology. Better than most attorneys I've met, Carla forced a laugh. That's absurd. We were at the bank about our own finances. I also know about the mental competency evaluations you planned, Edward said, his eyes locking on hers. And the papers in that leather case? Power of attorney, correct? It's documents that would have given you control over my money, my medical decisions, even where I live. Catherine, seated at the side table, set down her pen. Mr. Hayes, if that's true, I can't notarize these under any circumstances. David's face flushed. Dad, you're twisting this. We were worried about you yesterday. You seemed so confused. Edward leaned back. Yesterday, I was acting. Today, you're seeing exactly who I am. He opened a folder on his desk and slid out a thick stack of papers. These are records of every payment I've made to you in the past 3 years, 247. Transactions, mortgage payments, car repairs, private school tuition for Sophie, grocery money, $85,000 in total. And while I was doing that, you were researching how to take everything else. Carla's composure cracked, her tone sharpening. We love you, Edward. Love doesn't involve conspiracy, he cut in. Love doesn't involve plotting to have someone institutionalized. While they're still perfectly capable of living independently, for a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent. Then Edward reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out another set of documents, his newly drafted will. He spread the pages on the desk, sliding them toward Catherine. He's placed all of my assets, every dollar, every property into a protected educational trust for Sophie. She'll have full access at 21, if you both renounce any. Claim to my estate and prove over the next year that you can be responsible parents. I might reconsider. But until then, my financial support ends today. David's hands trembled. Ed, please. We can fix this. You'll fix it, Edward said evenly, by getting jobs that support your family, by living within your means, and by showing me Sophie's well-being matters more than my bank account. Carla's voice was tight with panic. We suppose to live without your help? The same way millions of other families do through honest work and responsible spending? Catherine notarized the will with deliberate care. Everything is legally binding now, she said, sliding the signed pages back to Edward. James gave a small nod. This is an excellent trust structure. Sophie will have every opportunity you intended. Edward stood, his voice steady but cold. From here on out, words won't matter, only actions. Show me over the next year that you've changed. Till then, consider this chapter closed. David looked down, shoulders slumped, while Carla's eyes darted toward the door. Edward knew what each was thinking. The game they'd been playing. For years had ended in a single morning and they had lost. The house was quiet again after David and Carla left.